Good morning. Can I welcome members to the 23rd meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2012. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery that electronic devices should be switched off at all times. No apologies have been received this morning. We have a full turnout of committee members. And our first item this morning is an evidence session on kinship care. The Education and Culture Committee held a round-table evidence session on kinship care on the 17th of January 2012. And the purpose of the session was to review the effectiveness of the current support mechanisms for kinship carers, and particularly the extent to which they gain support from local authorities or otherwise. Following that meeting, the committee wrote to local authorities, the Scottish Government, COSLA and the UK Government on issues raised during the round table. And after receiving written evidence, the committee agreed to invite the Scottish Government and COSLA to give further oral evidence. COSLA have declined our invitation to attend this morning, but have provided written evidence. But the Minister for Children and Young People is here today. The committee will also consider petition 1420, which concerns kinship care, immediately after this evidence session. This committee will discuss the issues raised in the petition with the Minister first, though, and therefore I'm delighted to welcome to the committee Aileen Campbell, Minister for Children and Young People, David Blair, Head of Looked After Children Policy, and Leona Solly, Policy Officer, Looked After Children Unit, Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. Can I ask, Minister, I presume you have an opening statement that you would like to give us?
Yes, I would, and I'll just start that now. Okay, yes. Thank you. So I would like to start by thanking the committee for the opportunity to come along and speak today on the topic of kinship care. And as you said, Convener, I'm joined by Leona Solly and David Blair from the Scottish Government. This government's vision for children and young people is clear. We want Scotland to be the best place in the world for them to grow up, a place where rights are respected and where children can access all the opportunities and support they need when they need it. Now, we've been working hard for kinship carers and for the children who are in their care since 2007. Now, I outlined our achievements and progress to date in my response to the issues raised at your round-table discussion on kinship care in January. Therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to tell you about the work we have been doing since then. As most of you will be aware, the Scottish Government has set out an ambitious legislative programme which includes the introduction of our Children and Young People Bill, aiming to help us on our journey to achieve our aim of making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. And through that bill, we want to introduce a new kinship care order into family law to support the parenting role of kinship carers. This will provide an alternative option for a child whose long-term well-being is best served by being with kinship carers. The Scottish Government has great hopes and ambitions for kinship care. It has been an early priority of ours to really listen and engage with kinship carers about what they need, and we are confident that the kinship care order is evidence that we have been doing just that. Through the National Kinship Care Service funded by the Scottish Government and provided by Children First, we are now communicating with hundreds of kinship carers across Scotland. And in July alone, we increased our communication base by an additional 47 kinship carers. This growth is unparalleled and shows that we truly are listening to the voices of kinship carers. Now, as we move forward with kinship care, our aim is to help families help themselves. The kinship care order provides a better platform on which to help kinship carers stay or get into work, and it will mean a fairer and more transparent relationship with the UK benefit system compared with the current situation faced by kinship carers of children who are formally looked after. However, some children will need to remain within the care system, and right now the support for kinship carers across Scotland varies. Support for kinship carers, both financial and non-financial, needs to be more consistent if it is to be fair. The Looked After Children Scotland Regulations 2009 makes provision for the payments of allowances but does not determine how much and to whom an allowance shall be paid. To enable us to reach consistency, we recognise that this will need to change. Kinship carers come from all walks of life, and the support required will differ from carer to carer and from child to child. We will need to ensure that the most vulnerable receive the most support. Parents, and by parents we are referring to not just mums and dads, but anyone who is involved in raising a child of any age, are the single biggest influence on a child's life, their caregiver, role model and teacher all rolled into one. Whether temporary or permanent, kinship carers provide a safe, loving and secure family home for our children to thrive and to flourish. So I believe that kinship carers who take on this responsibility make remarkable efforts in often very, very difficult circumstances, and they should be fully supported in carrying out this role. So I hope that sets out briefly some of the actions we've done since the response went to the committee, and I look forward now, Convener, to taking some of your questions that no doubt the committee will have.
Thank you very much, Minister. I appreciate the statement. That's very helpful. Can I just ask members to indicate when they have a question? And I've already got indication from Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I was going to ask you about the petition that we're looking at later on in the agenda. We've tried to get a kind of as full a picture as possible to the situation facing kinship carers compared to foster carers. Just wanted to ask how many kinship carers currently get the same allowance as foster carers in Scotland, and how many local authorities pay the same allowance to foster carers as kinship carers?
I think you've been provided with the table that we have as well, which will give you an outline of the what the local authorities pay in terms of kinship care allowance and what they pay as well to foster carers, and that breaks down the local authority as well. So that'll give you the, if you don't have that table, I'm happy to provide it, but I think you must have that.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, we do have that table, Convener. It gives us details of 20 local authorities, and there's 12 that aren't contained in that. But I was, obviously asking whether the Scottish Government had the whole list of 32.
We have the 32 list, but we don't have that. But certainly, if that's something that you feel that you would need, I'm always engaging with COSLA. I've got a meeting today with COSLA. I can pursue that again. But certainly, I think the illustrative kind of figures that you have with the table that you've got give you a kind of brief snapshot, albeit not of all 32, but gives you an indication of what local authorities are doing around the country.
Yeah, and obviously that table, the table does show that out of the 20 authorities surveyed, five authorities pay the same rate of kinship care allowance as foster care allowance. Do you think, given what was agreed in the Concordat in 2008, that is progress, and those 5 councils should be congratulated for achieving that?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, we fully recognise that the picture across the country for kinship carers isn't fully consistent across the country. So we need to do more to understand that, and that's why we're commissioning a review of the financial support that is provided by local authorities, and that will hopefully give us much more clarity about what the picture is, because we do need to make sure that there is much more consistency across the country. And so I think that certainly within the spirit of the Concordat, it was local decision making that was required. The local authorities have made the decision to provide support, however what that varying scale may be. But certainly since 2007, this administration has made far more progress by formally recognising, in a way that had never happened, kinship carers. So progress has been made, and most, if not all, local authorities are making efforts to help their kinship carers.
Can I just ask, do you welcome that the five authorities pay the same rate as kinship care and foster care, and
Yeah, I think whatever support local authorities gives to their kinship carers is to be welcomed. There might be room for always much more help, but that doesn't always necessarily equate to financial support as well, which is why simultaneously to the financial commitments that local government gives to their kinship carers, the Scottish Government's been working very hard with other partners, not least the third sector and Children First, to make sure that the other much more holistic support is there as well. So I do welcome the support that local authorities provide for their kinship carers.
So you think kinship carers should be paid the same as foster carers?
I think what we need to do is have a better understanding. We've been listening to local authority, to kinship carers through the engagement we have through Children First. We want to make sure that there's a much more consistency across the country, which is why we're reviewing the financial support to tailor the assistance and improve that consistency that I think everyone agrees it needs to be looked at across the parliamentary chamber, and we'll review that and aim to have that done within the timescale of the Children and Young People Bill. So I think what we need to do is not stop, not rest on our laurels. There has been progress, has been made, more needs to be done, and we would like to work with local authorities to achieve that. But the other side of the financial bargain is that there's this interaction with the UK benefit system too, and that needs to be dealt with as well. You know, I've written a number of times to UK ministers. I've met with a UK minister as well to make the point about the challenges that kinship carers face through the UK benefit system. So that needs to be dealt with too, because we do understand that kinship carers regard themselves often as being in a parenting role. So we need to make sure that the system is in place to make sure that that supports that kinship care relationship.
Can I just clarify, you are saying that kinship carers should be paid the same as foster carers?
I think what we need to do is make sure that we get consistency across the country, which is why we are working hard to make with local authorities. We'll work hard with others as well, not least Children First, to make sure that we can get that consistency, which is why we're undertaking a review.
Can I move on? I've got a lot of folk who want in. We'll no doubt come back to that question. Jean Urquhart.
Thank you. Really just following on from your earlier response, Minister, and that is the other than financial services, when we had our evidence session in January, there was a situation or a scenario painted with an emergency situation, middle of the night, services for a child that was being removed from the family to a foster carer. All the other services seemed to kick in, whether there was a need for cots or blankets or feeding bottles or whatever, as compared to a child that was staying within the family. In other words, going to kinship care, where none of these services. And I just wonder if we have some more evidence in the same way that we've got an interesting table of the financial situation from local authorities. But I wonder if that's a given now, that these services should be there for children going into kinship care.
Kinship care. Well, regardless of what a situation a child faces, it is in, you know, regardless of whether they are fostered or adopted, or, you know, whatever situation a child may face and find themselves in, getting it right for every child truly is about getting it right for every child, and needs to make sure that the services that are in place to help that child fulfil the outcomes that that child deserves, that their needs are met, and that their well-being is at the heart of the services that are around them. So it needs to be, regardless of the parenting structure that supports that child, services need to make sure that things are in place to make sure that that child can have the best outcomes that they deserve, which is why also, which I know the committee will be very interested in, the Children Young People Bill when that comes forward, we aim to put GIRFEC on statute so that there is much more increased tempo around implementing GIRFEC around the country. Again, it goes back to that consistency, so to make sure that children are dealing with services that are holistically provided for them. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, some of the other kind of services around, you know, some of the other ways in which we've gauged the support that kinship carers needs, what the needs are, has been through the engagement that we've had via Children First, to make sure that we truly are listening to the views and needs of kinship carers, and we're getting a direct voice and link through that national line to make sure that we can tailor services to meet their needs.
Okay. Neil Findlay.
Returning to the theme that Neil Bibby was raising, the Concordat under the heading Specified Set of Commitments says kinship care, providing allowances for kinship carers of looked after children to treat them on an equivalent basis to foster carers. Can I ask again, Minister, do you believe kinship carers should be paid the same rate as foster carers?
Well, as I said in relation to my answer to Neil Bibby, you know, part of this is about working with local government. I've got a meeting with Douglas Chapman. I can raise that with him. It's my first introductory meeting with him to make sure that he's knowledgeable about the questions that I've had from the committee today, but we definitely feel that there needs to be consistency across the country for kinship carers, which again is why we're having this review. So we can ensure that the input from the committee is part of that review and make sure that your views and any
Minister,
queries you
it's
have
fairly
are
simple.
there.
It's a fairly simple question. Do you believe that kinship carers should be paid the same as foster carers?
We believe that kinship carers are closer to parents, that they have a parenting role. We have this understanding directly from kinship carers that they believe that they need to be recognised for the parenting role that they carry out, which is why local government needs to tailor the support on an individual needs basis to make sure that the outcomes for the child are the best that they can be, which is why we always need to work closely with local government to ensure that there's consistency across the country on this issue. But also there needs to be a recognition that the UK benefit system has a part to play in this as well, which is why, you know, the welfare reform changes that are happening down south need to be questioned, and maybe we need to make sure that we shine a spotlight to ensure that kinship carers are at the forefront of our thoughts about how we make sure that they don't get left behind in any changes that happen.
I'm finding it difficult to understand why you won't give us a straight answer on that, Minister, when the Concordat clearly states that they should be treated on an equivalent basis to foster carers. Why can't you not just give us a straight answer whether you believe that should be the case or not?
Well, what we believe, as I said, is that kinship carers should be treated as parents. Now, at the time in which the Concordat was written, it was, you know, I think it was felt that that was a good way to move forward. And let's not forget that there has been substantial progress made since 2007, and that this administration has recognised kinship carers in a way that the previous administrations have never done. More kinship carers are getting financial support. What we are doing is now making sure that the voices of kinship carers who want to be recognised in the parenting role that they carry out is recognised fully and is not impinged upon by other areas of government such as the UK benefit system.
If I could frame it differently then, in order to try and get an answer, will you bring forward a proposal within the Children and Young People's Bill to ensure that kinship carers are treated in exactly the same way as foster carers?
I've said what we're doing in the bill, and that's to provide a kinship care order. If you would like to contribute to the bill consultation closes on the 25th of September.
I was always led to believe that ministers came before the committee to answer questions, but obviously that's not the case.
Well, I think that's a little strong, Mr Finlay. I think the Minister has answered. You may not particularly like the answer that you've been given, but that's not the same thing at all. Liz Smith.
Minister, could I ask, you very rightly said in your opening remarks about the fact that the payments for kinship carers are widely varying across the country. In your discussions with COSLA, will you be asking for details from local authorities about the arithmetical models that they have through which they make these payments, so we've got a better understanding of why there is such a variance?
Well, as I say, I'm having a meeting with COSLA today. That's really an introductory meeting because, of course, since the election, there's personnel has changed, and certainly I've outlined that I intend to have a review, a financial review of the support that kinship carers face and the inconsistencies that everyone is well aware about. So we certainly can factor that into the any review that we have ongoing as well, and make sure that those points that you raise about what modelling they do is much more fully understood.
Would you agree that that might be helpful in terms of giving us a better idea of the criteria by which payments are made, whether these are genuine, or they're all criteria genuine, but whether these are genuine in terms of trying to provide that support, or whether they have been forced into circumstances because of council cutbacks in other areas that they've had to obviously try to cut back on what they offer.
I think certainly a review of what's going on is necessary because of the inconsistencies. I think given that we need to make sure that councils are supporting families to make sure that the outcomes for the child that they is in that kinship carer's care are the best that they can be. We need to make sure that packages are tailored in an individual way so that support is the best that it can be, and that may require then maybe being a bit more sophisticated about understanding the modelling that councils do. So I think certainly if that answers, we can take that as part of the review.
Yeah, I think a further point, Minister, is if obviously the nature of local government is for them to make the decisions that are appropriate in their own particular council area. notwithstanding that, would the government be minded to investigate whether some kind of minimum payment across the country might be a good idea?
I think these things need to be on the table when you're kind of doing a wholesale review, and given that we've got an opportunity as well with the legislation through the Children and Young People Bill, we need to make sure that we use this opportunity to really have a close look at what's going on around the country. So certainly those points that you're making are worthwhile exploring.
Right. Just my final point on, I'm pleased with the answers that you give, but just on that point, how soon in terms of the timetable do you think we could have that information available? Because I think it would be helpful to inform us as we work through the bill, some of these points, because they're obviously factual points that I think
that you need to explore. Certainly our intention is within the kind of timescale of the bill preparation that we would be working along those kind of timelines. Certainly we can get back to you with more clarity on some of those times about this kind of review, which is sort of, it's independent of the actual bill, but certainly will be informative for the bill, and we can get back to the committee with any more clarity on that.
Do you know when, roughly?
Well, the bill will be, the legislative programme has been kind of laid out, and I've said, that we need to then prepare a financial memorandum for the bill, but certainly this review about the particular issues around kinship care isn't part of the bill, but is informative for the bill, so we will get information and clarity on the dates for you later on, but it's within, broadly we want this information around at the same time.
Be helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Just following up earlier questions here in relation to the Concordat commitment. I mean, obviously, Minister, you've indicated this morning that there are inconsistencies we're all aware about, and certainly, although it's not a full list, the 20 councils that have submitted details of what they provide, I think bears that out. Does this not highlight, in a sense, a weakness in the Concordat, in that it's pretty explicit in stating that allowances for kinship carers have looked after children to treat them on an equivalent basis to foster carers was, in a sense, a joint commitment between the government and COSLA back in 2008. From what you said this morning and the evidence from local authorities, we really aren't there, and the differences between different councils, and indeed within councils, between the rates that are paid to foster carers and to kinship carers varies enormously. As I say, does this not illustrate a weakness in the Concordat, that we are where we are 4 years on?
Given what I've said as well, though, that the Concordat and the administration's work around the regulations to recognise kinship carers, and the fact that since 2007 far more kinship carers and more local authorities are providing support, I think it actually shows that there's been a lot of progress made so far. Now, albeit I understand, from your questions and from the fact that we recognise in government that there are inconsistencies across the country, which is why we're having the review of the financial support there for kinship carers, that we need to continually work with local authorities, because it's right as well, though, that local authorities have the autonomy to work in a way that best supports the parents that live in their area. So we need to get the balance right. We need to have some kind of consistency. We need to have some kind of, kind of parity across the country, and what kinship carers can expect in terms of their support. But we also need to respect local decision making too, and we need to respect that local authorities know best how to help deal with the parents that live in their area. But we need to focus on the most vulnerable. There has been much more progress made so far. We've got a parenting strategy coming up as well, which will again articulate the needs of kinship carers in a way that kind of illustrates their parenting role as it should be.
But does that not illustrate the tension there is between these various aspects of the same commitment? That we had an agreement between COSLA and the Scottish Government back in 2008, but we're now in the realms of a review, an order pending and legislation, which strikes me as suggesting that the Concordat hasn't done what it was meant to do, that you haven't been able to deliver.
Concordat's helped a number of families across the country, and far more progress has been made than any
I know you keep insisting that, but the level of
administration, which I believe your party was part of.
The level of inconsistency that exists, the fact that you're having the review, the admission of those ongoing inconsistencies, the fact that we've got an order pending, that legislation is required, would tend to suggest that you concede that the wording of the Concordat, the commitment that reflected, has been undeliverable through that mechanism, and you're having to go down a different route.
What we're having to do, by listening to kinship carers, by responding to the things that they tell us, by responding to the needs that they tell us, that the areas that they need support, we're responding in a way that gives them and their children the best outcomes that we can help them achieve. And I think that's the right thing to do. Kinship carers tell us they want to be recognised for the parenting role that they do, which is why we want to help them support that, which is why we need to bring forward an order to help that interaction with the UK benefits system much easier for kinship carers as well. So there are lots of intricacies. It's not a kind of straightforward subject. There are lots of intricacies within this as well that need to be dealt with. But I believe that the Concordat has delivered an enormous amount of benefit for not just kinship carers in terms of the support that is being provided by far more local authorities than has ever been the case before.
I may have to beg to differ, and not least on the basis of the petition we will be turning to later in this evidence session. But you say you're listening to kinship carers, you're talking about the parenting role that they perform, and clearly that's a message the committee's received as well. But it would suggest that the approach taken by local authorities are that you go down the route of the parenting role. The likelihood is then that some of the support that's currently available through local authority means would then dry up. So it's not augmenting it through a benefit system. What we've been told in evidence is that there is a trade-off between them, and both positions are legitimate. But to suggest that the inconsistency can be built up by
bring about benefits to the kinship carers through interacting with the UK government to make sure that some of those clawed back benefits aren't clawed back anymore, has shown that the government can work, with the UK government to make sure that the benefits, to make sure that the kinship carers are properly financially supported.
And clearly there's been progress in certain areas of that under the welfare reform proposals, but it doesn't explain the inconsistencies. I mean, one of the, along with the message to Gosling, to Douglas Chapman in particular, that turning up to the committee and answering questions himself would be much appreciated. What we've got from them is a litany of all the difficulties that are faced by local authorities in this area. But none of that explains the inconsistencies between local authorities, because all of those difficulties will be faced equally by each of the local authorities. And therefore it's the inconsistency which quite understandably has kinship carers, and asking the question, well, why, if this is possible in one area where a council is under the same budgetary constraints, is facing the same requirements in relation to the benefit system, etc., why is it possible for them to deliver in whatever way and provide a greater degree of consistency and parity, but not in my own council area?
Well, that's what I've talked about the review of financial support, which we're commissioning to make sure that we have a better understanding of what exactly is going on. And in response to some of the points that Liz Smith raised, I think that will shed greater light on that for us, and will help us tailor the packages of support for individual kinship carers in a far better way than has been achieved maybe before.
Final question. Would it not have been better to have a review before agreeing the Concordat along the lines of allowances for kinship carers that looked after children, and to treat them on an equivalent basis to foster carers was signed up to?
Well, I think at the point in which the Concordat was signed up, it was in the spirit of agreement to work together. And, let's not forget, enormous amount of progress has been made since 2007 because of that joint working with national government and local government, because of the Concordat, to ensure that there has been progress for kinship carers.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, of course, prior to 2007 there was no support for kinship carers at all. It was introduced by the SNP government in 2007 through the Concordat. But I wonder if the Minister would care to comment on what effect the financial downturn has had on the demand for kinship care allowance over that period, and specifically how that has been skewed across the country to areas of deprivation such as Glasgow.
Well, there's always, certainly in areas like Glasgow, there's always much higher demand, I suppose, for want of a better word, for kinship carers. And so, again, it goes back to the point that each individual local authority has its own particular needs. In Glasgow's perhaps, a case in point where kinship carer rate is higher. Certainly, I would imagine that economic downturn, as for every family, given that we're talking about parents and families and children, you know, in a broad sense, have all been affected by the economic downturn. There will be impact because of that. So we need to, while we don't, I wouldn't be able to tell you, you know, at the moment if there's any kind of statistical evidence to sort of show that that's had any further detriment to kinship carers. I think we know that those families that are living in poverty, the economic downturn has had a hugely negative impact upon them. But we need to make sure why local authorities, the inconsistency of the financial support for local authorities, we need to make sure that we get that right, which is again is why we're having the review, which is why we constantly engage with the UK government about their changes to welfare reform to make sure that the support measures that we know exist can be put in place to help these families.
Yes, I would like to better understand this problem with the UK benefit system. It's referred to in the written evidence from COSLA that income from kinship care payments to recipients of housing benefit following representations has now been disregarded, but that there are other benefits where there remains a clawback. What sort of benefits are those, and what sort of problem does that pose to the typical kinship care household?
Well, certainly the work from government at the moment has meant, and the work that has been done around council tax benefit, for instance, it has meant that some families are now £50 better off as a result of the work the Scottish Government has done to ensure that those benefits are no longer clawed back. But certainly our aim as well with the kinship care order is to make sure that interaction with the UK benefit system is much, much better. And certainly I don't know whether, David Blair, would you like to, can you maybe elaborate on some more of the work that you've done around the clawback and the benefits system?
Just in terms of answering your question, I think the as the Minister said, I think we've managed to secure some changes which insulate kinship care payments from council tax and housing benefit clawbacks, but there remains some fairly fundamental other benefits which are part of the kind of family environment. So child benefits is an obvious example, where the ability of a kinship carer of a looked after child in particular to claim it is often frustrated. It generally is not possible to claim it. There are some exceptions to that. Those who do claim it are usually advised that there is a risk that it may not be a competent claim, and that therefore there's a risk of clawback. And so therefore kinship carers carry a heavy risk that they will be benefiting by, say, £20 a week for the first child, quite often more, and that's an awful lot of money to risk being clawed back. The way it gets even more complicated is that child benefit is a passporting benefit to other things, and so things like child tax credit. So in respect of wanting to bring up a child as a parent, you would expect to claim child benefit and then child tax credit if your income is low enough, if you're in certain types of work and so forth. Generally speaking, you're excluded from that entirely, though we know there are some examples where that is claimed, and it's the same risk, which is that it's potentially it can be clawed back. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. It sounds to me like that's a horrifically complex system, and it's one that's the navigation of which is a burden that's being placed on people that really are having a lot of other things asked of them as well. How, again, this is perhaps a question for the Minister, given that it's more political, how do you consider the response of the UK government to have been in terms of how the other benefits are dealt with, those in particular that were just outlined there? Mm-hmm. Have they been helpful or otherwise?
Well, I have, like I think I said in reply to a previous answer, I have met with one of the government ministers who's now recently moved a post, who didn't have responsibility for kinship carers, but did have a kind of an interest in the area. And certainly we made the point that kinship carers are a particular group that face quite considerable challenges when interacting with the benefit system, on top of all the other challenges that you raise, Marco. So we've made the offer. We said we would like to engage further on this issue. it's been, you know, maybe being kind, it would be because of the changes in ministers at the moment. We need to pursue these issues a wee bit further, because at the moment we knew we need to kind of help kinship carers out on this issue. But certainly we made the offer to try and, you know, allow them to engage with kinship carers in Scotland, to hear firsthand how they had felt and about dealing with the UK benefit system. That offer's yet to be taken up, but certainly was an offer that was made because we feel we need to make sure that ministers, UK ministers, understand the real challenges that kinship carers face. But as I say, that offer has yet to be taken up. But certainly, you know, in terms of what our aspirations are for our country and for our aim of making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up, having control of your own benefit system and welfare would make a difference, because we could bring about some clarity to what is a very complicated area indeed, and perhaps bring about some of the changes that we think are necessary for kinship carers.
Final point, which follows on quite well from that, I was going to ask, do you think the devolution of council tax benefit has made it has made it easier for the UK government to change that, in the sense that if they hadn't, then we would have when it reached the Scottish Parliament?
Well, certainly I know that, you know, maybe, you know, unlike Mr Liam MacArthur's assertion that the spirit in which the Concordat brought about closer working between local government and Scottish government, I think the work that's been done between the Scottish Government and local government in trying to mitigate against the worst impact of welfare reforms, particularly around council tax benefit, shows that just exactly what that can achieve, and it can be positive benefits for people.
Joan McAlpine?
Question was covered by Mark.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much. Liam MacArthur.
Thanks. You say, Minister, that obviously under independence you'd have clarity on how the welfare system would be structured. Now, I've sat through at least a couple of debates where I've heard much about simpler and fairer, but very little on the detail.
Certainly to allow that clarity to be brought.
In terms of the challenge in applying for child benefit, child tax credit and all the rest of it, I certainly don't underestimate the extent to which that is true, but could you perhaps clarify whether foster carers are eligible for those benefits in the context of the fact that we're looking at the discrepancy or the inconsistencies between the provision for foster carers and for kinship carers?
No, foster carers are not, because they're not seen within that parenting role as
so
kinship carers
that in a sense doesn't really have a bearing.
No, I guess what would have a bearing is that if you wanted to change the eligibility for child benefit, then you could do so if the powers were within your gift to be able to achieve that.
But that doesn't explain the inconsistency that currently exists that you're trying to resolve through child benefit, child tax credit, but which don't apply to foster carers.
Forgive me, can you repeat? I'm not sure if I can entirely understand the point you're...
Well, the fact is that we're looking at the issue of the inconsistency between the provision for foster carers and for kinship carers. You've talked about an area where there's a level of clawback, but if foster carers are not entitled to any of those benefits, then I'm struggling to see how that has a bearing on the inconsistency that you've admitted exists between the provision for both those groups.
Well, as I say, and what kinship carers have told us, that they want to be recognised in terms of the parenting role that they do and they carry out, and they carry out very, very well. So we need to make sure that they are supported fully through that by the UK benefit system, and at this point in time that's not always the case, so that's where the differences lie.
Can I ask you, Minister, what steps have you taken within the direct responsibility of the Scottish Government to provide financial support to kinship carers?
Well, we provide the block grant to local authorities.
But you've not provided, you know, you're saying that the Scottish Government is suggesting that the level of kinship care allowance is a matter for individual local authorities. Yet you're also suggesting a national minimum allowance for foster carers. Why are you perpetuating the difference between kinship and non-kinship carers?
I'm not sure. I mean, the way that the block grant works is that we give there's no ring fence, and so we give the block grant to the local authorities, and then they are entitled to make their decisions at a local level about how they then support financially their kinship carers.
But you're saying local authorities are responsible for their own budgets and can take their own decisions and use the money as they see fit, but the Scottish Government could do the same. And I'm asking, you know, what financial support is the Scottish Government giving direct to kinship carers?
Again, I sorry, but I mean, we give non.
Well, actually, Neil, I'm just trying to seek clarity. I mean, I'm not absolutely sure what you're asking. I'm just. Just clarify it a wee bit. Sorry.
Just what financial support does the Scottish Government give to kinship carers?
Well, it's provided through the block grant, which we give to each local authority, which is agreed nationally. Goslar.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, we give, for instance, though, we do provide support in other ways, which has been very, warmly welcomed by kinship carers through the work that I think I've already said about with Children First and other areas of support in terms of helping kinship carers navigate their way around some of the very complicated structures that are in place. But I think the point remains that the block grant is the way that kind of the system works.
Okay, Neil Finlay.
Just to pick up on that, the block grant is provided, but subject to the concordat. And that's the point I think that's been made, because you've got a concordat, an agreement that you will get X if you do Y. Y ain't happening, and that's the issue. But could I come to the evidence provided by Councillor Douglas Chapman, the COSLA spokesperson? And I know you're not responsible for his evidence. However, he says in his submission that the confusion has led to perverse incentives, with children becoming and remaining looked after with kinship carers for financial rather than welfare reasons. The inference in that is that there's a bit of a scam going on here. Is there any evidence of that? Because there's no evidence in his paper. Therefore, I'm just wondering whether the government agrees with his assertion.
Just it's in the causal evidence.
It's in the causal evidence.
Top
yes.
Page 3, the paragraph at the top page.
Yeah,
just
first paragraph, page 3, bottom 2 lines. This confusion has led to perverse incentives, with children becoming and remaining looked after with kinship carers for financial rather than welfare reasons.
Well, part of that reason is for bringing forward the kinship care order, to make sure that we don't, as you say, have this system where perversely you end up with more children looked after than you would ideally want.
Yep,
so again, it maybe goes back to the point in which I made about the review of the financial support, that we can evidence that with more statistics or whatever, but certainly what we have and one way we want to try and remedy this is by introducing a kinship care order to ensure that children can be have a much more nourishing and nurturing family life by intervening earlier and ensuring that less children maybe become looked after.
But what I'm really asking is that statement true, and would you regard it as true? And is there any evidence that this is actually occurring?
Anecdotal evidence through Children First.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions from members? Liam MacArthur.
A very quick one. On the statistics we've been provided in terms of family and friends placements by local authorities, I think if you exclude what must be a statistical anomaly in relation to Orkney, which is down around sort of 5%, Glasgow, I think quite understandably, is at the upper end. There does seem to be quite a large discrepancy between, for example, South Lanarkshire, Murray, West Lothian, which are around about 15%, and then a large bulk of them which are up around 25 or almost 30%. I mean, is there any reasons why, is there approaches that councils are taking in relation to the way in which they place looked after children that would explain that? Or I mean, it's again something perhaps more for COSLA, but
it could be more for or for the individual councils and their themselves, but certainly it might just be that it's a culturally different place, and that there's been much more, maybe more prevalence of kinship carers being used as a place. But certainly, in the grand scheme of looked after children, outcomes are better for kinship children placed with a kinship carer as well. So we need to make sure that that's fully understood, and local authorities will bring about how they where they place a child through different ways. So we need to maybe have a better understanding of that for individual local authorities, but certainly that might be best answered by the individual local authority or COSLA themselves.
Lord Smith.
Can I just put on record again the point I made earlier, that I think it would be very helpful if we could have a little bit more quantitative evidence to back up some of the government's key points. I mean, this is a very complex area, obviously, and it's not easy. I think we all accept that. But I think we would be better informed if there was a greater wealth of statistical evidence out there that would better inform our opinions, because I think some of it is maybe a little anecdotal and it's not, sufficiently robust to inform the policy discussions that we're having. If I could just make a request for that.
Okay. I think that's a point well made, and I think we all feel. I mean, I'm sure the government shares that that doubt.
Which is why the review is will be ongoing, and we'll make sure that that you get some more information if you require it.
That would be helpful, Minister. Thank you. Joan McAlpin, did you have a question?
On record my confusion at the Liberal Democrat position, given that they spend a lot of time telling the government that they're too centralising and that local authorities should have more decision-making powers. But in a case like this, where local authorities do have decision-making powers to make the right decision for people in those areas, they complain about inconsistency.
I'm sure the points made. It's on the record, and I'm sure Liam MacArthur disagrees with it. Well, let's not descend into name calling. I think that would be very unhelpful. Can I just, Minister, just finally ask you, could I get a little bit more depth on the kinship care order itself? You've mentioned it a few times in your evidence this morning. It would be, I think, helpful to understand exactly what you envisage that order achieving.
Yes, the kinship care order will be part of the the Young Children, Young People Bill, and the committee will then be able to, have a much more rigorous approach in which you can look at that. But it's to have their role clearly identified and defined in law without the need for the child to have looked after status. We believe that will be a number of benefits for the order, because it would allow, it allows the children not to be looked after. It allows for quicker decision making without necessarily having the court interaction as lengthy as it sometimes is the case. It can be prepared before birth as well. It's designed to give local authorities much more scope in their ability to help families to avoid that formal care route if deemed appropriate. So there are a number of benefits we see that will come from this kinship care order and allow kinship carers to be formally recognised in another way through legislation.
I mean, the causal evidence, Mr Finlay referred to the second part of the paragraph, but the first part talks about, at the top page 3, confusion surrounding the way that kinship carers are defined. Is the kinship care order effectively supposed to strike at that very confusion?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sure we'll look at it in detail when it comes to the bill.
Yeah. But it's about trying to find another route to permanence as well for the child, and to give kinship carers much more support without some of the needless bureaucracy that sometimes ensues for them.
Well, I'm sure we'll look forward to examining that in detail when the bill comes forward. Can I thank the Minister and her team very much this morning for their evidence, and can I suspend briefly? Our second item this morning is consideration of petition P1420. Members have received a copy of the petition and some background briefing. Can I ask members if they have any comments to make at this stage, given the evidence we've received this morning and the details of the petition? Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. I think one of the things that I raised and Liz Smith raised as well was about the lack of information about the level of support available to kinship carers and actually knowing the full picture that's happening in Scotland. I think we should certainly follow that up with the Scottish Government. I know the Minister gave a commitment to provide us with more information. I certainly think we should do that. I also think it would be helpful, given that we've heard from the Scottish Government today, to go back to the petitioners, Clickmanager Kinship Care group, to ask them to come back and give oral evidence to see what their response is to the government so far.
Okay. Liz Smith.
I think the first point is absolutely valid, and I suspect we've got agreement round the table for that, because I think the more we are informed about it, the better. So I would certainly agree with that. I'm open-minded about whether we need oral evidence from them, but
Claire Adamson.
But I welcome the commitment of the Minister to provide that additional information this morning. So in terms of what we do with the petition, I think we should leave it open and go through the scrutiny of the bill and revisit it after that process.
Yeah, I agree with Claire and others. I mean, it would be helpful, I think, as part of the additional information, even if we were to get further information from those councils that have already provided. I think to look at the trend, because I mean, appreciate that's a snapshot of where we are now. But the argument is that this is something that's moving in the right direction. You're dealing with a different issue than if that's been in place for sort of 2 or 3 years and hasn't really moved at all.
Marco Biaggi.
I was just going to make a point with regard to oral evidence, that perhaps that's something that would fall very well into the consideration of the Children and Young People Bill.
Neil Finlay.
I think we should also make an effort to try and convince Councillor Chapman to come before us again, given that it's COSLA who are, have a very significant role to play in this, and if he were coming to give evidence, then it might be an opportunity for the petitioners to come at the same time, and we can get that all done and dusted under the one session.
Any other comments from members? Sorry, Jean.
Just support. I mean, I think we keep the petition open because it's clearly absolutely relevant to everything that's being done. But that would be alongside the work that the bill that's being done for the bill.
Okay. Well, I think there seems to be general agreement that obviously we're going to keep the petition open because it really has. We haven't come to any conclusions at this stage, and there's obviously it's very relevant in terms of the ongoing work that we're doing, and in particular the upcoming bill. That's very clear. I get the sense members are keen to seek more further information, but more detailed information in particular from the Scottish Government and local authorities, whether that's through COSLA or through individual local authorities. I certainly agree with Liam MacArthur's suggestion that we seek to fill the gap from 20 up to 32, so that we've got a fuller picture across the country. So I suggest that we write to both the Scottish Government and COSLA and the individual local authorities that are missing at the moment to try and fill the evidence gap there. I also think, though, that this is very much obviously going to be under consideration in the Children's and Young People's Bill that's coming forward. I would suggest that we write back to the petitioner, if members are agreeable, urging them to submit detailed evidence to the committee in terms of in advance of us looking at the evidence in that bill, and before we decide who we invite to bring evidence before us orally. So I think I'm suggesting we don't take a decision today on that. We take the decision when we're deciding who our witnesses will be and at that point decide. Liam MacArthur.
Just for clarity, Convener, I entirely agree about seeking the information from the other 12 councils that we don't have to date. But actually what I was suggesting is we actually look for the information about how those numbers have changed over the last two. The trend,
Apologise, yes.
I think, because that will give us a slightly different and clearer
We will ask that as well, and I don't know whether Space can help us seek out some of that information as well. We'll ask that. Neil Bibby.
Given that, you know, obviously Click Manager, Kinship Carers Group are the petitioners, I think, and it's their petition. I do think we should, you know, hear from with oral evidence. Given that it is their petition, I don't suppose anyone's got a problem with that.
Well, yeah, I just suggested that we decided at the point at which we decided who was coming to give us oral evidence in terms of the bill, because clearly, as we know, as part of the consultation on the Children and Young People Bill, kinship care is included. There are questions on kinship care in that consultation, and given that, as the Minister said, the kinship care order is intended to be part of the bill, that it would be at that point we should decide who comes along to give us evidence on that. I'm suggesting. Sorry, Marco.
With regard to historical trend information on kinship care allowances, can I suggest that we have it from 1999, if that's available?
We'll get as much as we can, okay, to try and provide us with a fuller picture.
Well, if the point that has been made by the government is progress since 2007, it would seem to be perverse to start a historical trend at 2007.
Right, okay, we'll do that. Any other comments? Sorry, Neil?
I mean, just in relation to the COSLA spokesperson comment, at what point would be?
Well, I mean, as I said, we did invite COSLA. COSLA declined to come on this occasion and provide written evidence. I will, and I have rather, sought an urgent meeting with the COSLA spokesperson to try and ensure that Mr Chapman's available for our next invitation. And I would fully expect that COSLA would be here to give evidence in relation to the bill itself and kinship care at that time. And whether or not there's an opportunity before that point, we'll see as we go along. But I agree with you in terms of the disappointment I'm sure you're expressing that COSLA were not available to come along today.
But it's our intention to get them along at
Absolutely. Some point. Are members agreeable then to the course of action we've roughly outlined in terms of additional information and to discuss who our evidence, oral evidence should be at the point where we discuss all possible oral witnesses, at the same time encourage the petitioners to write in with further detailed evidence or information they wish to submit to assist us in that process. Is that agreeable? Great, thank you very much. Can I suspend briefly before we move on to the next item? Our third item this morning is an evidence session on Creative Scotland. It's approximately 1 year on from the last time Creative Scotland gave evidence to the committee and 2 years on from its creation. This will be the committee's final one-off evidence session on cultural issues prior to the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs giving evidence to the committee on the 23rd of October. Can I begin by welcoming to the committee this morning Matt Baker, public artist, Andrew Dixon, Chief Executive Creative Scotland, William Gibbons, Director Shetland's Arts Development Agency, and Francis McKee, Director Centre for Contemporary Arts. Before I move on to the questions this morning, of the witnesses, we have received a correction to the evidence that was given at last week's committee meeting by Francis Cummings, Director of Music at Systema Scotland Big Noise Raploch. He has confirmed that Big Noise has indeed received public funding, including from Creative Scotland. So just he wanted that correction made to the record for the evidence last week. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for coming along this morning. Can I begin this morning's questions from Claire Adamson?
In my observation over the years, funding for the arts is not normally without controversy of some kind, and not least in the time of change. And I was just wondering if the panel would like to comment on how many applied for the previous flexible funding and didn't receive it under the old system, and if there were any sort of anomalies that had kind of thrown up, and who actually received that funding and didn't. And also, given the Cabinet Secretary's letter in July to Creative Scotland, and also Creative Scotland's response to extend flexible funding for a further 6 months, what concerns are there still about the new funding models which still need to be addressed?
Thanks, Claire. First of all, I just want to put the flexible funding into context. So Creative Scotland is now 2 years old, and we've had a very major programme of change. What all the focus is at the moment is the change from funding these 60 flexible funded organisations into a new territory where some of them will be funded from grant in aid and some will be funded from lottery. But of course, Creative Scotland was set up to do different things. And when you look at the range of different things that we've done, just in the last 12 months, establishing a TV production fund, running Festival of Arts and Creative Ageing, the Luminate, increasing our showcasing, running the London 2012 cultural programme, our Creative Futures residencies with 70 artist residency hosts, our partnerships with Young Scott. We're into lots of new territory. But to do that, we had to free up some of our grant in aid budget, also in an environment where our core funding from the government was understandably reducing in a very pressured environment, though the overall support from the Scottish Government has increased. So that's the context. Creative Scotland inherited commitments to 60 flexibly funded organisations. Decisions were taken 2 weeks before we came into being. And all of those 60 organisations were doing really good work. They were very high quality cultural organisations, festivals, theatre producers, galleries. But they were the 60 out of 120, 130 that applied. So there were many others, Pitlochry Festival Theatre, Wee Stories, the Bayer Theatre, the Controversies of 2 years ago, that didn't get funding from the flexible funding. And this flexible funding was a 2-year project commitment. So what Creative Scotland's been trying to do is to make this more sustainable and stabilise it. And the way that we've done that is reviewed all our organisations. We've actually increased the number of foundation organisations, and we've put a few organisations, Cumbernauld Theatre, Highland Print Studio, Edinburgh Print Studio as foundations. We've given 22 organisations what we call annual funding, but it's in our budget for 3 years. And these are things like St Magnus Festival, some of our networking bodies like the Federation of Scottish Theatres. And then we're going to invite 49 to bid into the lottery, where there is more opportunity for them to realise their artistic and creative ambitions. And for the moment, we're giving them slightly preferential treatment. They're being solicited or invited to bid in to a lottery programme, and we hope that we'll be able to support programmes of work for the next 2 years. I say slightly preferential because there are still organisations like Wee Stories, Pitlochry Festival Theatre and the Bayer, who we also want to find ways of supporting. So what we're trying to get to is a level playing field in 2 years' time, and a situation where we can free up some of our Scottish Government grant in aid in difficult economic times to do new things, to cover the geography of Scotland and strategically deliver in places where there isn't cultural infrastructure, whilst allowing these creative organisations to realise their ambitions through, hopefully, lottery funding.
I mean, I'm not going to encourage everybody to answer every question. In fact, I'd rather everybody didn't answer every question, otherwise we'll be here all week. But if anybody else wishes to contribute to this question, then I'm happy for...
Well, Francis is one of those organisations affected. So.
Well, I've opened the door, Francis. It's up to you.
I think it's probably why I'm here. It's been... Obviously, it's a fraught process because it's change for a start. And we're quite a large enterprise. We're a small organisation, but a large enterprise. And so I think there have been problems along the way, and those problems are still in negotiation and evolving as we go. The problems to begin with for us perhaps were it seemed to come out as project funding initially, which for us, we do 18 exhibitions a year, 440 events. We've got 12 cultural tenants. We've got 3 businesses who rent from us. You can't really go project by project in that kind of enterprise. That's a business that is long-term business that needs to plan ahead. You need to have 3-year, 5-year plans. You need to be able to talk to the people, take 2 years to plan an exhibition. So that was worrying for us at first. And as Andrew said, that has now moved to, we can then plan for a 2-year programme and apply for a 2-year programme of projects. So there's been a constant evolution of the parameters of the new bid that are helping us as we go. And that's been positive, and that has maybe been a little under the radar in those positive changes that are happening. But they are changes that we needed to see happen as well, because they destabilise us otherwise. If we look like we're going to be funded project by project immediately, that looks unfeasible. So we've had those kind of discussions. I think the other thing with the extension, that was very necessary, because when you look at what's happening, we have to programme and we have to respond to, say, the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games from both the City and Creative Scotland are only announcing what they're doing in October, and from October through to Christmas. But if we had to put in our initial bid by September, then we would have already planned what we had done for 2014. And as a major venue and a major contributor to Glasgow in the Commonwealth Games, that wouldn't have been much use to Glasgow or ourselves, because you can only respond when you know what people are planning to do. And those plans are evolving and coming out as well. So we need to be able to respond to them. We need to find out what's happening, and therefore we can respond better to those. It's the same with strategic commissioning. We might like to bid for that, but if that's announced after September, then we would have also not known what was the strategic commissioning. Would we want to bid? Would we be successful? Would we leave gaps in our programme? What happened if we didn't get it and we'd left gaps in our programme? So these things are now following in a much more logical sequence, I think. That makes more sense to us in terms of making decisions about what we might want to bid for, what we might be in line to do or be able to do usefully. And I think the initial timeline was kind of reversed, and that didn't really work for us, in that we were guessing in the dark what we might be trying to do. And with the extension, we're now able to look at what's coming up, what we can actually work towards, and what we maybe can do usefully and bid for usefully, what we shouldn't do, where we fit in, if we're successful, obviously. But those things all become slightly more logical, and we've got slightly more chance of success in being useful as an organisation if the chronology is changed as it now is. So it's been a very positive process for us, actually. And that doesn't get mentioned much in the media, but it's a good staff in Creative Scotland, and they really know what we're doing, which has been very good, because we do quite a strange economic model. That's a new economic model, and that's been accepted and supported. And that's been very positive. But that chronology and that working out how we're actually going to do it has been worrying. And I think the other thing I should say, maybe on behalf of all the flexible funded organisations, is there's a worry about the relationship to lottery. Lottery looks as if it's project funded, and that looks as if that's the parameters of the funding, but we're now talking about much more sustainable funding through lottery, which we all welcome, obviously. We just want to know that the lottery agrees. And so there's a few things like that I suspect people know some of these answers, and they maybe need to be more communicated. There needs to be a sort of more visible dialogue with the community on those things, because there are a lot of good things happening, but that's not been reported, and it's not as visible as it could be. And I think that's what's worrying the art community.
Thank you. Matt Baker.
Yeah.
Andrew mentioned level playing fields, which is a good place to start, coming from the south of Scotland, because Andrew actually inherited a situation where there wasn't one single flexibly funded or foundation organisation south of Lanark. So actually we weren't too bothered about the fact that the changes in flexible funding. We were actually looking forward to the fact that we would be able to be working on a more level playing field. Having said that, huge respect to the flexibly funded organisations. I guess I'm here, if you like, representing maybe the kind of like possibly the foundation funded organisations of the future. We represent the artist-led groups that are coming up at grassroots level, really in response to the fact of some of the cuts. And I think we're really already committed to a kind of social enterprise type model in the way that we're operating. We're not expecting core funding. What we're expecting from Creative Scotland is advocacy and assistance in partnership working, breaking down some of the barriers that are would allow artists to work directly with local authorities, with education departments, with tourism departments, with the environment, with health. This is the playing field that we want to work on, and using the arts as a tool for wider social good, actually looking at what the arts are for. So that's what we're looking for in terms of new development models, and some of the, quite a lot of the noises that we're getting are quite good.
Thank you, Gwilym.
I think it's good for me to comment on the fact that we're an organisation that moved from being a foundation organisation to being an annual client, so went through that process of change. And for us, sure, it was a bit scary and it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but on reflection, the whole process we feel was very robust and incredibly useful for us as an organisation to stop and kind of take stock about who we were, where we were going, and spend a focused amount of time in face-to-face conversations with officers within Creative Scotland to think about our model. And certainly I feel that being an annual client is a very positive place for us to be, because it's much more suited to the nature of our organisation, wanting to be more responsive, dynamic, looking at more of a kind of social entrepreneurial way forward. So although change is difficult, it's been a really positive process for us.
Thank you. Claire?
Just very quick. Supplementary, one of the aims at this start was to make the whole process more transparent. Do you feel that that's been achieved? To all the panel?
We'll start with, we'll just go Gwilym, and then we'll miss out Andrew. We'll go to Matt, and then we'll go to Francis.
Yes, the process I felt was very transparent, and maybe later on I'll talk a little bit more about how I feel the whole of the organisation feels a lot more transparent now, particularly being in a location where we don't get the opportunity to, I guess, network in the way that others might do in the Central Belt. So I welcome the transparency that's there.
Matt?
I'm going to disagree with that wholeheartedly. I think that's been one of the problems to date with Creative Scotland, is that the perception has been that there's 5 people in a room in Edinburgh making decisions about the country, and we in some of the rural areas we're really lacking that representation. We're really lacking a route into that situation. We don't understand what portfolio managers are, how we can contact them, and we're coming from the outside, we feel.
Okay. Francis?
I probably have to agree with that there is good dialogue face to face, but I think there's not enough getting out there to the public, and there's not enough dialogue with the community publicly, really kind of core dialogue about the arts for people to feel that the questions have been answered. So I think they need more answers, and they need more dialogue to have that trust. That trust is sort of being lost at the moment, and that's dangerous. And I think it's because there are good things happening, but those things aren't getting out. And so there's a communication gap that needs to be bridged as much as anything else, because there is a lot of good things in there, a lot of really good people, and that communication just has to happen more, I think, to have that trust. That's what people want now, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you respond, Andrew, and then I'll bring in Claire Yoki. I'll bring in Marco and Joan McAlpine.
Well, the first thing to say is I'm absolutely committed to transparency. Anybody on my team knows that's what I've done in the past, and that's what I want to deliver within Creative Scotland. I don't think we've got it right. in terms of being clear and transparent, we are doing a brilliant number of things, and I hope, if we had 8 hours, I could probably tell you all of them.
We don't have 8 hours.
But we've not been good enough at getting information out about the change, and we have directly to our organisations that we're dealing with, but it's people around the edges that have been commentating in the press and elsewhere. And so, hands up, we need to do more in terms of communicating and also listening to people's concerns. But I just want to answer Matt's point in terms of geography. Again, people know I am committed totally to Creative Scotland delivering for the geography of Scotland. I worked in the past with 54 local authorities. I'm working with another 32. I'm at date 28 of a 32-date tour of every local authority chief executive, and that's on top of a lot of other touring. And we have got a model where we have got our portfolio managers who look after an art form, maybe festivals, and then a geography, where our portfolio managers are starting to take more responsibility for parts of Scotland and for places. And we've done a number of things that have been very much about trying to get into the areas of Scotland that haven't got that core infrastructure, and that's I was pleased Matt referenced that, because the Lanarkshires, the Ayrshires, Dumfries and Galloway, the Borders, Angus, Moray, these are the places where we don't have resident professional cultural infrastructure in many cases, and we need to, through our strategic commissioning, get to that geography and provide the level of opportunities and participation, engagement that people enjoy in Edinburgh and people enjoy actually in places like Shetland.
Okay, thank you. Marco Biaggi and then John McAlpine.
I'd like to go back to one of the points that was raised twice in your first contributions, that of the lottery funding. It's my understanding that guarantees were set in legislation at the onset of the National Lottery, that money provided from it wouldn't be additional to public funding, would be additional to public funding, it wouldn't replace public funding. Could you perhaps just explain how this use of lottery funding is in accordance with that?
Yes. Without going into too much complexity on the lottery, what the lottery can't do is replace government funding. So in this case, people have asked, well, how come these flexibly funded organisations can bid in for lottery funding? Is that not just replacing what the Scottish Government gave them? It isn't, because they only had a 2-year commitment to a programme of work for the last 2 years. And we're inviting them to bid in for a different model and a different programme. And they have to bid, and it's competitive. So we're not breaching any additionality. Lottery funding can be used for revenue, and a number of the lottery distributors, the big lottery, sport, have been revenue funding individual elite athletes. Do perhaps more revenue funding than we have in the past. We want to explore that further, and in fact my board agreed last week that we're going to do a survey to find out what all the lottery distributors are doing, both the arts lottery distributors, many of which I know I designed the lottery programmes in England, but also Heritage Lottery and Sport Lottery, because there are different models. In Ireland, in mainland Ireland, the lottery and the treasury money come as one lump, and there's no differentiation. In Northern Ireland, the Arts Council there will fund core costs for cultural organisations, but up to a ceiling of £70,000 for, I think, 2 or 3 years. There are lots of different models. We have the ability to be quite flexible with the lottery, and that's what we're trying to do here, to transition to a new situation where we can keep as much of that work happening, because these cultural organisations are absolutely central, as Francis said, to things like the delivery for the National Cultural Programme for 2014. So we want those organisations to be really thriving.
And with regard to the last point there, one of the concerns, or one of the uncertainties I've heard from art stakeholders in my constituency, and given it's Edinburgh Central, there are 1 or 2, is about the balance between the commissioning and the responding role. And I know that's had quite a bit of salience in the media recently, not least with Fiona Hislop's remarks in August. I wonder if perhaps you could explain how you see that balance functioning, especially with regard to the creation of the Strategic Commissioning Fund.
Yeah. Well, firstly, can I just maybe explain? Creative Scotland's primary role is there to support artists and cultural producers, and the majority of our funds, the foundations, the flexible funding, our open access programmes, are about responding to the ideas of artists and creative individuals. Commissioning is where we're trying to deliver something specific to an objective, either to reach some of that geography of Scotland and address a gap, or to build on a strength. So we've got a huge strength in children's theatre in Scotland, but we haven't got enough of it. And if we want to do something about that, we have to commission more children's theatre and ensure that there's the opportunities for that to tour across the borders and Ayrshire where there isn't as much children's theatre happening. So that's our strategic commissioning, and our reviews of the various art forms are leading us to conclusions in dialogue with the theatre sector and dance sector about some strategic commissioning. We've also got a role in commissioning major national events like the London 2012 Cultural Programme, Speed of Light on Arthur's Seat, Michael Clarke's Barrowlands, the Torch Relay, which went round all 31 of the 32 local authorities with the Summer of Song. And we'll have a responsibility with Glasgow Life for commissioning projects for 2014. And the Cabinet Secretary's written to my chairman just last week, clarifying that she absolutely supports the central plank in Creative Scotland's plan around strategic commissioning, but wants to ensure that there is just that balance. And in reality, the balance is that 80% of what we do is invest in cultural organisations and artists on their own terms, but 20% will be done to try and address those gaps and to build on our strengths.
Could I just say something on the strategic commissioning front? I think that certainly speaking from the Southwest point of view, that's one of the issues that we have with what's going on at the moment, in that we need investment to build up our own infrastructure. And what's happening is we're getting large cultural producers being commissioned by Creative Scotland, being parachuted into our areas, and actually swallowing significant amounts of our local budgets to put on projects that are not well, the one that happened most recently in our neck of the woods was Out of the Box, which has basically left a lot of discord locally and has been quite destructive to local infrastructure. So that's one of those issues about how that strategic commissioning happens is a really important dialogue that needs to happen, and that's one of the problems that we've got is we don't have a route into those discussions.
Okay, can I bring in Joan McAlpine at this stage and follow up with Jean Urquhart?
Well, I would like to hear Mr Dixon answer the point that Matt Baker's just made about big outside companies coming in to deliver projects and taking away from the local arts infrastructure. But I also think that we need to look at some of the very stinging criticisms that's been made of the changes in the way that you project fund, and in particular the allegation I think needs to be answered is that bureaucrats are now managing the agenda of some of our most accomplished artists. That won't change. You might have extended the situation and a bit of stability until 2013, but after that you're going back to this project-based funding, which people feel is basically interfering in their artistic freedom.
Right, well, I can take the first event in terms of Dumfries and Galloway. I'm assuming you're referencing the public art, the community street theatre events that have happened. Is that right, Matt?
The UZ.
Yeah. So this is an organisation called UZ Events. They've been based in Glasgow for many years. They used to run the big street outdoor festival in Falkirk. And UZ Events, as part of the Year of Creative Scotland, bid into ourselves for some lottery funds to do a major programme of public art across the country. They've certainly not been parachuted in. They're a Scottish company. They wanted to develop their projects in areas across the country. So they worked in Shetland, they worked in Argyll and Bute, they worked in Dumfries and Galloway. And we were quite pleased that they were working in Dumfries and Galloway as an area that's perhaps not had as much independent cultural production. I'm concerned to hear if that has in some way destabilised local activity, but for us that was an artistic decision by a cultural organisation based in Scotland deciding on where they wanted to work. If I can come on to the second point, Joan. First of all, Creative Scotland are not bureaucrats. I've got artists and people with vast cultural experience involved in taking decisions about cultural activity, but nor are we artistic directors. We don't take the artistic decisions. We back the ideas and the creativity of individual artists and cultural organisations. And if anything, what we've been doing is trying to devolve more of our money to cultural organisations to take those decisions themselves. When I arrived in Scotland, I was getting a lot of criticism that it was the same artists got the same funding from the same budgets every year. And I've seen evidence of it. What we've done is to devolve far more of our money to artist-led organisations, and I want to do more of that. So we devolve money to the likes of Playwright Studio for writers and now for film writers. We devolve money to the Scottish Book Trust for novelists and writers. We've devolved money to Awards for All that are doing local community projects. And our whole Creative Futures programme of artist residencies, there are 70 residency hosts, 370 residencies and placements supported in the last 18 months. Now that's 70 different cultural organisations or colleges or others that are taking those decisions about which artists to employ. That for me is a much more plural way of taking cultural decisions. But I will defend my team. We're not bureaucrats, we're not administrators, we're people that are skilled at taking creative decisions and trying to make the best of the limited resources that we have to benefit the whole of Scotland.
But by funding one project at a time, you're basically making an artistic judgment on each project.
Where people apply to us for a single project, we're deciding whether that project is a good quality project, whether it reaches audiences, and whether it's got a strategic fit with the programme, whether that's an education programme or a festivals programme. That's always been the case. That's what arts councils and cultural agencies do. With FXO funding, we're not just funding projects. We're funding programmes of work. We're funding the core operating costs of those organisations. And it's others that have introduced these phrases like cherry picking. We're not about cherry picking. We're about deciding which organisations' proposals we can afford to back and to let them fly and to do things on their terms. So we would never take a decision that, such and such a theatre company can't do Macbeth because there's been 3 other productions of Macbeth this year. That's up to that cultural organisation to decide what its programme is. We may take a decision as to whether we can afford the scale of ambition that's being asked of us, and that's right and proper in a situation where we can only ever support probably 50% of the bids that come to us.
Certainly, as I say, I think it's important that we raise some of the very serious, criticisms that have been made of you. Like Joyce McMillan, the theatre critic of The Scotsman, said that your new approach was imposing a kind of pseudo competition on artists by suggesting that by making them more insecure, they would become sharper and more creative, when in fact artists thrive in cooperation and synergy.
Well, I ran a thing called the Year of the Artist in the year 2000. 1,000 artists in 1,000 places, absolutely about giving bottles to take to the party to artists. That's the way Creative Scotland wants to operate. We're not about trying to control individual artists. I think one of the messages we perhaps haven't got across is that having devolved a lot of money to these other organisations, the money for individual artists is out there, but artists can still come to Creative Scotland with their own ideas, with their own plans for professional development. And we supported many artists, writers, dancers, choreographers. An example is the recent Unlimited programme, where 4 disabled choreographers from Scotland produced work as part of the London 2012 programme. Claire Cunningham, Caroline Bowditch, Ramesh Mayer Pan, Mark Drew. These are fantastic individual artists that we're supporting absolutely on their own terms. I've had a conversation with Joyce recently, and Joyce and I don't disagree on a lot of things. I agree with the line that everybody's saying, that we need more sustainability in our cultural organisations. I'd love to be able to offer 5-year revenue funding to all of these organisations in Scotland. We have a limited budget, and we have to work with that limited budget in a difficult economic time.
If you've developed the kind of close working relationship with artists that you say you have, why did the Cabinet Secretary feel that she had to write that pointed letter to you, telling you to work more closely with artists and creators? Do you not feel slightly concerned that as the head of our cultural agency, the Cabinet Secretary has to tell you to improve your relationship with artists and creators?
I think it's quite appropriate for the Cabinet Secretary to reflect views that have come forward from the public and from our constituency. And we recognise we needed to listen more to artists. We need to not just work through the intermediary agencies that we're funding to support artists. So we're putting in place measures to do that. We've had a very good dialogue over the theatre review that we've done with a lot of people engaging with that consultation process, and now with the dialogue of how we spend the money. We're going to do exactly the same with dance, with visual arts and crafts. We're very committed to talking to artists. It's quite good sometimes if the artists came and talked to us and we could listen to them directly. A lot of the commentary has been happening in the press and in Twitter rather than directly engaging with Creative Scotland.
Dean Urquhart, please.
Thank you, and good morning. Can I follow on the same theme to a certain extent about governance and management and clarity of decision making? I mean, with a huge reduction in staff from the old days of the Scottish Arts Council, could you talk a bit about the change in decision making that's happened? I mean, there was just in the past committees for each art form. A member, usually the chair of the committee, would actually be on the board of the Arts Council and report back on the work of that committee, decisions taken and so on. So there was a kind of information. Now, I'm not saying that everybody was happy with that at the time. You know, the structure of the Scottish Arts Council was seen as cumbersome and not working and not being light enough on its feet and so on. So accepting that. But where are we now? And maybe there are people perhaps who knew that system now who need to know how it's changed, and who does make the decisions is kind of part of that. How are they made, and do people know? And just maybe picking up on the point that you made about the company going, I think, to the borders, who with a street theatre or whatever, and somehow a mismatch again. What kind of references would a company need who was coming to you? First of all, were they funded because of a competitive process that you were announcing there was money to be available for the borders? And did they apply for that? And did they then have local partnerships with local people who did want to have it, even if Matt Baker didn't know about that? But just as an example.
Can I just stop you there? Probably enough questions to be getting on with, and we'll come back to you.
Okay.
But, first of all, budgets. Scottish Arts Council did some really good things, and I was one of the first people to say, this organisation isn't broken. It was doing really good investment programmes, things like its Inspiring Communities that supported brilliant projects like the Matthew Bourne Lord of the Flies with young people in Western Barton, the Inspiring Communities project with Motherwell and Prisons. There were lots of really good programmes. But the majority of its budgets were tiny budgets locked away in art form cupboards with quite big decision-making processes around them. And, as you say, a bigger staff and a big advisory structure with committees and steering groups and other things around it. Creative Scotland's saved £1.5 million a year and continues to save £1.5 million a year on its operating costs. We've reduced from 155 staff to just under 100. And we've gone down from having 108 separate budgets to having 15 investment programmes, which in time I think will become clearer. And with the exception of film, our investment programmes are cross art forms. So we invest in artists and talent, we invest in audiences and access, festivals and events. And these are broader. And the decisions are taken by teams within the organisation. They'll typically be led by a portfolio manager with a team of development officers, with a range of people assessing them. And there's a greater plurality now of decision-making going on within the organisation. The perception is that the decisions are all made by my senior management team. I can tell you I don't go anywhere near the financial decisions. Those are devolved down in the organisation other than the very large-scale investments. Now, we need to get better, Jean, I think, at communicating that and showing visually where decisions are made. And I recognise that. But I think what that's allowed us to do is to be much more flexible. So if we've had a very high demand for literature festivals, for example, we've been able to increase our resources into our Quality Arts Production Fund and support those festivals at a higher level. So things like the Wigtown Book Festival or the Melrose and the Borders Book Festival have had better resourcing out of our new programme, whereas in the past they would have had a cap of the maximum amount of money for a literature festival is £20,000 because that's what the literature budget does. So I think we've been much more flexible, and we've actually increased success rates in our investment programmes, and we continue to monitor that. Now, you may say that there's not enough people applying, and that may be the case too. But in general, we've moved to a much more flexible way of resourcing. The second question, yes, it was a competitive process, and UZ Events, Scottish-based company with a good reputation, bid, and I think in each case there were local partners. They worked in Shetland. I'd be interested from Gwilym's point of view whether their work registered as being successful in Shetland. Certainly I've seen some very good media coverage about the work in different parts of Scotland.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure what happened in Dumfries and Galloway, but certainly our experience in Shetland in terms of the Roofless project, working with UZ Arts, was one of collaboration and co-production. So it didn't feel parachuted in, and maybe this is a reflection of the strong cultural infrastructure that is in Shetland. So we were able to respond and work with UZ Arts and who worked with local artists and performers. So that was an extraordinary project that took a large mechanical bird around our agricultural shows and reached an audience which was in excess of a third of the Shetland population, and an audience that we wouldn't normally reach with an art project of that kind. So it was a fantastic series of events that ran this summer.
Matt, given that you raised it originally, this issue about UZ and...
Back on that, I think it's part of the geography is part of the problem, because when Andrew says it's not parachuted in, frankly, when from the southwest of Scotland we consider things from Glasgow parachuted in. That is the geography that we live with. Some of the issues that the Creative Scotland is doing phenomenal stuff, and I don't want to be the person that's been the critic here, because I'm not a critic of Creative Scotland really. The Creative Places scheme is a phenomenal scheme. Which members that maybe don't know is it places bid around the country, and the cities aren't allowed to bid, but it's smaller places, and there's a scheme. There's 3 places that get an award every year. The problem is that actually should be the rule rather than the exception, and it only happens once a year, and it's actually a relatively tiny amount of money. They're also doing things like the place partnership, and Dumfries and Galloway, we are a place partnership, and our experience of that is that some of the High Hegians from Creative Scotland came down and visited a couple of times, and then suddenly this kind of structure arrived about what we were going to be able to do as the place partnership, but had sums of money against particular bids. In the meantime, Dumfries and Galloway completely reinvented its arts infrastructure with really positive partnership, working with the local council, and invented a thing called the Chamber of the Arts, which is a sector-led commissioning organisation, which is in partnership with the council, which is revolutionary, and there are regional arts hubs developed all around the region which are feeding into that, and yet we're still stuck with we're having to work with this set of pots of money that are the place partnership, and we can't turn it into what we need it to, which is actually to get somebody from Creative Scotland to come and sit as part of that Chamber of the Arts model and help us build it into something of a national scale. So it's not just about one particular project. I don't want to. Things go wrong in the arts for all sorts of reasons, and it's great to hear that worked in Shetland. I'm not having a pop at particular projects.
Francis?
I'll make it quick, but there's maybe a Glasgow-based biased one, that there is a very fragile but vibrant infrastructure there, an ecology of different organisations that actually produce things from the grassroots up to international level that has achieved international success. So there's a fear that if you pull out the wrong things, you may collapse everything. And that's a worry about how well that's understood yet. And I think the portfolio managers have a large part to play in this in terms of the decision making. The portfolio managers have really in-depth knowledge in Creative Scotland of the different art forms. And it's knowing that they're actually involved enough in each of the art forms at different times to make those decisions is important. That, I think, is a concern in the community, how much they're involved in each of those decisions. So I think that's one thing.
accepting what Andrew Dixon is saying, that it's the portfolio managers that are making decisions?
I think it's hard to know at the moment.
Hard to know.
I don't
So-
know is the
so
honest
we need,
answer.
We need that kind of
Yeah, I think
clarity.
we want to see them come through more.
Yeah.
And for us, we've seen them come through more as we've had one assigned to us who knows us very well, and that's been very reassuring. I'd like to see more of that maybe for other people. I think we've
Right.
benefited
And
from.
finally, just on the governance structure, there was in the Scotland Creef audit criticism of a risk, and I quote from it: "There is a risk that the board is given insufficient information to scrutinise the performance of the organisation." Did you did you accept that criticism?
First of all, Creative Scotland's had more clean audits than an organisation would normally have in 2 years, because last year we had 2 separate audits because it wasn't a full year, one for lottery, one for treasury, up to June, and then another audit for the second half of the year, and then we just had another 2 audits, and all 6 of those audits have been unqualified and clean audits. Inevitably, within an internal audit process, we're looking for areas of improvement. And one of the areas of improvement is the reporting that we can give to our board in terms of information. Performance measurement is something that I think we're only at first base on at the moment. We're developing a framework for performance measurement which links to government outcomes, but uses the information that we get from cultural organisations to give an indicator of health. Now, there's some things we'll measure on a long-term basis, like economic impact, like the household survey, which recently came out very positively for the first year of Creative Scotland. And there's other things that we'll measure on a monthly basis to see the health of the cultural sector. And I think that's the area particularly, Jean, that the auditors have aligned on. Our IT systems that we inherited weren't adequate for doing that, and we've just procured a new IT system which will come into place in April, which will enable us to give more reporting through to the board on some of that performance.
I don't know if Willem would have perhaps I suppose personal experience, because are you still on the board, or you were on the board?
I was on the board, yeah, and certainly during that period, I wasn't aware of not having enough information to make the decisions we needed to make as board members, and having to send officers back to give us more information. So it felt robust. I mean, certainly I was there from that first 2 years, which was obviously a period of focus on the new structure and developing the corporate plan and how we go forward. Creative Scotland's a young organisation, and now's the time to be looking at the data that's been generated through that first years of activity.
Time's moving on. I have to get other members in. So brief questions from Liam MacArthur and then Marco Biaggi. Mark was okay, so okay.
Just very briefly, Andrew, you've mounted a fairly staunch defence of your team, and clearly it's been a challenging time reducing from 155 to, I think you said, just below 100 in terms of staff. Are you content that you have the kind of range of skills, the skills mix within that new complement to cover all the bases? And in particular, I noted there was one concern that on the board, only 1 out of the 11 members was a practising artist. Are you comfortable with that makeup? Do you think that it's something perhaps over time you'd want to address, perhaps as a way of picking up the point about improving communications across the various art forms?
Well, if I can deal with the board matter first, Liam. It's the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary that appoints our board. I have no input to it whatsoever, other than in recruiting some additional members to our board, suggesting some areas of expertise that we might like the government to look for in the board. We've just recruited 4 new board members, one with particular expertise in animation, one with education and visual arts expertise, another who's involved in Gaelic singing, and a 4th that's got TV production. In actual fact, there's more than 1 artist on our board, but they might not have artist as their main title. So I think we've got an increasingly strong board and a board that's engaged. I think it'd be good that artists feel more able to come through those sorts of government recruitment processes for boards. Today isn't the place to scrutinise that, but certainly in the past when I've recruited boards, there's been an ability to specify that you're looking for so many artists in a board. I think we recognise we've got a good board and it's still a new board, but we also need to go out and find other ways of talking to artists and getting cultural expertise in. You know, I'd love to be having more conversations with Matt and Matt feeding into my board. So we're looking at that at the moment and trying to find ways of dealing it. In terms of expertise within skill sets within the organisation, we've got a terrific team. We went down from 155 staff to under 100. We actually went down to 85 and then recruited back about 15. There are still one or two areas where I think we do want to build our expertise in resource development, levering new funds, in TV production experience. We've also, at the moment, dealing with the pressures of taking on an awful lot of extra things with a reduced staff. So what you're seeing is Creative Scotland doing a lot more than its predecessors with a third less staff. And actually with now an increased budget. So we've got our lottery income is going up, as you'll see from the material we provided you. And that creates demands and volumes on the organisation. Just in processing finance, we're dealing with £20 million more than we were 2 years ago. And so we are going to have a look at our capacity and the skill base within the organisation 2 years on and see what it is we need to be fit for purpose into the future.
Joan McAlpine?
In terms of making these connections that you say you plan to make with the artists, I noticed that in Matt Baker's written evidence, he suggested that one of the ways that you could do that would be to appoint regional officers to work directly with artists rather than having artists always have to go through a middleman all the time. Is that something that you would be consider taking forward?
The principle of it, I'm totally committed to having people that think about geography and think about place. But we committed to delivering a savings target for the government. We delivered it. And to put 30 more people into our structure is just not tenable. So what we've got to do is to empower our specialists in other areas to take an interest in geography in Dumfries or in Shetland or in other places and to spend more time there. And we've got the basis of that happening. And I was concerned to hear Matt's comments about the Dumfries and Galloway partnership, because the place partnerships are very much about working on local terms and local authority terms of what they want to deliver. And with the place partnerships, we've got that opportunity to spend quite an intensive piece of time talking to a local authority area and understanding what works best for them. So I've initiated a number of those, and last week I was in Argyll and Bute, and I think we've got the basis for a really valuable conversation to happen. We've had a brilliant place partnership in Fife. We've developed our work in Perth and Kinross. And the next phase, which will go into North Ayrshire, Aberdeenshire, will, I think, start to address some different issues.
It's not working, and clearly, you know, in Dumfries and Galloway, artists are saying that it's not working. Are you going to revisit it and find a way to make it work?
I'm certainly going to talk to Matt after today and find out what, you know, in detail the concerns and have a look. As far as I'm concerned, you know, the reports we're getting about the place partnership in Dumfries and Galloway, it's still early days. We had a fragile infrastructure. There was the loss of Dumfries and Galloway Arts, an ex-FXO under the Arts Council. There were cuts made by the local council there. And so we were starting with a fresh base, but there's been some terrific things happening in Dumfries and Galloway. Two of the place partnerships that were mentioned, two of the creative places, Wigtown, Creetown, new events emerging, like the Big Burns Weekend, really exciting capital projects emerging. I think actually Dumfries and Galloway is about to become a particularly exciting growth of infrastructure. And there was one project that we did parachute in to Dumfries and Galloway, and I'll tell you the story. We Stories Theatre Company, who are a children's theatre company, we asked them would they go and have a look at the lack of touring infrastructure in Dumfries and Galloway and the borders, and they went and took it. They developed their own show, took the tour, and opened up a potential 55 venues across Dumfries and Galloway and the borders. What they came back and said to us, however, is the long-term solution isn't about companies like themselves touring in those areas. It's about building children's theatre infrastructure in Dumfries and Galloway, which is exactly the point that Matt's making. We need to build that local infrastructure.
Can I just ask about you're talking about you can't take on more staff, which is, completely understand that. But is there any reason why some of your staff can't be based in a more devolved way around the country, say 2 or 3 days a week, hosted by local authorities? I mean, that presumably wouldn't add a massive cost. We've all got the internet and...
We do encourage quite mobile working. We have a member of staff based in Inverness. We actually do have one of our development officers lives in Dumfries and Galloway. I've got staff live in Dundee, St Andrews, West Kilbride. I've got people all over Scotland.
Can I just clarify? I mean, I'm sure you're not using this deliberately, but live in Dumfries and Galloway isn't the same as working in Dumfries and Galloway.
No, what I'm not saying is that we, with the staff that we've got, that we can afford to be something like SNH and have satellite offices across the whole of Scotland. We've got a pretty tight staff structure at the moment. What we're trying to do is to use that staff to take a greater ownership of certain parts of Scotland, in the absolute commitment that we want to understand and work with every single local authority area.
Okay, John McAlpin's got
one last, if I may, Convener. I take the point you raise about costs, and we live in difficult times. However, you have commissioned a lot of outside consultants to do work for you. All your sector reviews have been undertaken by consultancies. And again, it's one of the issues that Mr Baker raises in his written evidence about the amount of money and the number of projects given to consultancies. Are you able to tell us how much you're spending on external consultants?
We can certainly provide you with written evidence on any consultancies that we've commissioned in the last 2 years. Creative Scotland, I suspect, spends significantly less on consultancy than its predecessors. I far favour us doing things ourselves. In the case of the Theatre Review, we commissioned an external consultant because we didn't have a portfolio manager for theatre at the time, and we felt it needed an objective outside view, and Christine Hamilton has delivered a fantastic piece of work with a lot of consultation. In the case of music, we had a need in terms of capacity to commission somebody externally and also to get an objective view, and we commissioned a Glasgow-based company called ECOS. The dance review has been done in-house, our crafts review has been done in-house, our visual arts review is being done in-house. We use consultants relatively little.
If you write to us with the detail, that would be helpful. Yeah. Thank you. A very brief question from Claire Asman, and then we move on to Neil Bibby.
Okay, I beg the convener's indulgence. I hope the answers will be brief. It's really to get to the nub of this issue about the infrastructure, and obviously there's a variance of cultural infrastructure across Scotland, and historically has that capacity been built up with the local authorities and cultural trusts, as now an example of Glasgow Life, and for the future, is it really Creative Scotland's role to build that capacity, or should that be being delivered either through cultural trusts of the local authorities or the arts organisations themselves?
I would say it was the latter. I actually don't see it as Creative Scotland's responsibility. I think that their responsibility is to create a better playing field for us to work on, and to encourage the partnerships, be the advocate, and break down some of, like one of the really practical issues that we have as artists is being able to cope with local authority procurement procedures. We're just not set up to do that. And those are the kind of things that Creative Scotland could really effectively do, is break down those bureaucratic hurdles for us to actually work with health, work with tourism in ways that we can't at the moment, because this culture is there that the artists are somehow these kind of odd special creatures that normal people can't deal with, and we've got to break that down. That's what I was meaning about the consultants and the middle people, is that there's this culture built up that you can only deal with them through a sort of a middle layer. And I think that's what Creative Scotland is doing so brilliantly. I think it is actually breaking down barriers between art forms and looking at a sort of wider role for the arts, and trying to really encourage this idea of self-sustainability. But it's actually targeting that stuff that we need. Yeah.
Francis,
probably going to say I disagree slightly. I think you need, say again, Glasgow. You need Glasgow Life. You need the organisations, and you need Creative Scotland. and you probably need Visit Scotland as well and whatever else. You're building something that's grown over 40 years. Quite often it's artists who have done something that looks crazy in a derelict building that then get sort of made into something more official that then becomes something even bigger. And still there are artists coming up from the grassroots. Glasgow Life need to support that and have been very good consciously at supporting it as a regeneration policy and a new economy. And I think Creative Scotland is also part of this new economy for Scotland in which arts play a large role. So if you're going to do that, everyone has to be involved, because in one sense it's art, in the other sense it's an economy and it's an industry. And you need to be able to take us from grassroots through to international level. And you need to be able to have artists and organisations in there that can actually tell you when it's working and when it's slightly wooden and duff. And you know, both Creative Scotland, Glasgow Life are more likely to kind of go, sometimes they can kill something by supporting it, so you need artists in there to say, that's terrible, this is good. And Glasgow Life, I think, would happily recognise that at times. So you need them to step back at times, sometimes to come in and to trust artists and artist organisations, because we actually know the industry and we've built it up and that's been proven. You don't want to lose it. You know, it's taken 40 years to build it. You could lose it overnight if you lose it. So you've got to trust all of those things, and they can all work really well together. So.
Okay, Neil Bibby.
I want to concentrate on the geographic coverage because I think it is a key issue. I've heard what's been said about different areas of Scotland, but as a member of the West of Scotland region, I'm primarily concerned about that area. I was going through the the list of flexibly funded organisations in 2010-11 and 2012-13, and looking at the local authorities in the West of Scotland region: East Dunbartonshire 0, East Renfrewshire 0, Inverclyde 0, North Ayrshire 0, Renfrewshire 0, and West Dunbartonshire 0. I guess my question is, surely there are some with the wide variety of different areas in the West of Scotland region. Surely there are some companies or projects that are worthy of investment. But if not, what are Creative Scotland doing to stimulate artistic and creative activity in that area in the West of Scotland region?
Can I take this one? The first thing to say is what you're quoting is the figures which we presented in our corporate plan, because I wanted to be absolutely transparent about what historically we had taken on, where our foundations were based, where our flexibly funded organisations were based. And our whole strategy of strategic commissioning and all the concerns about this change is because we're trying to reach into the Renfrewshires, we're trying to reach into the Ayrshires, we're trying to spread resources, not to take away from Glasgow and Edinburgh. We need to be proud of Edinburgh as a festival city, proud of Glasgow as a production base, great centre for music and visual arts. But we need to find the cultural strengths of Inverclyde, of West Dunbarton, of East Dunbarton, of Renfrewshire. So it's things like Year of Creative Scotland, things like Glasgow 2014, things like festivals and events, and our place partnerships that are enabling us to have really useful conversations with local authorities and other local partners. I think there's some very interesting things about to happen in your part of Scotland. The new Beacon Arts Centre in Inverclyde is probably going to be one of the best theatre spaces in the country, and have an influence, I think, well beyond its own district. Obviously, in Inverclyde, there's the Waterloo Road and Shed Media moving in. There's a kind of creative industries growth happening there. Across the water, Dunoon, there's the Burr Hall being developed in Argyll and Bute. In Clydebank Town Hall being developed by West Dunbarton Council. In Renfrewshire, the two local authorities getting together to celebrate 100 years as part of Year of Creative Scotland. What we're finding is something to talk about and to support in every one of these areas. And I think you are seeing the start of an infrastructure change happening. And I hope in 5 years' time, if I'm invited back to give evidence then, you'll see the end of a journey.
Okay, Neil Finlay.
Just kind of following on that theme, it's just looking at the figures that you have provided. In 10-11, 14 of the 32 local authorities received no funding. Then in 12-13 on the foundation programme, 21 out of 32 received no funding. 12-13 on the flexibly funded programme, 20 out of 32 received no funding, and for the other organisations, 28 out of the 32 received no funding. I hear what you're saying about good things happening, and I don't doubt that for a second. But it is a huge challenge that you have, and you know, when are we likely to see those figures change for the better?
Well, the first thing to say is that obviously that is just the funding of those organisations, and some of those organisations will be based in a single local authority area, but they might be delivering across the whole of Scotland. You know, Mull Theatre, or COMAR as they're now called, based on Mull, actually deliver touring theatre for the whole of the north of Scotland. So it's not quite sophisticated, but what it is showing is that the core infrastructure is concentrated in certain areas. When I go and talk to East Lothian Council or Mid Lothian Council, I'm looking at typically a range of things that we're supporting. We're supporting youth music initiative activity, we're supporting festivals, we're supporting individual artists in that area. But you do find that the infrastructure has a correlation with the overall level of investment. If there are active festivals, if there are active artists like Matt, if there are public art initiatives, that's what generates the activity. So, I mean, East Lothian's quite interesting at the moment because they're really flying with their festivals. I was at Lammermuir Festival last night at Tantallon Castle, and what you're seeing is a kind of real maturing of a local authority supporting independent organisations, independent festivals to happen. And as a result, there's more resources coming from Creative Scotland to East Lothian. Same is the case in Fife. Fife has really started to build a body of cultural projects, which maybe 2 years ago it wasn't as strong. We were getting all the criticism for the Buyer Theatre decision. So it's more sophisticated than just those organisations, but we remain very open to having that debate about where our resources go and making sure that we do spread benefits across the whole of Scotland.
Could I ask two things? I mean, I totally get what Matt said in relation to the danger of a production or an event being imposed on a community, because the cultural difference between Dumfries and Glasgow will be huge. You know, in my own area, the cultural difference between a mining village in the west, the Lothians, and Edinburgh is, you know, massive. So I think there is a danger that, you know, there might be something brought in and done to people rather than them engaged in it. And I think we have to be careful of that. So in terms of the geographical area, geographical spread, are we likely to see more money going into grassroots community theatre and events and art? Because I think that if we build that, then that will eventually permeate through to the more, like Paul said, international and all the rest of it. I think that's where it begins.
I think there's a number of our programmes that are absolutely about trying to get into grassroots activity. So some of our work on cashback for communities, for example, is very much targeted on grassroots activity. Our support of Systema in Ratlock and the rolling out of that potentially to other places like Govan is absolutely about supporting grassroots. And our work with Awards for All and the Big Lottery, and we're working with the other lottery distributors to develop a potential programme for 2014, will be trying to reach communities across the whole of Scotland. I think it has to be a mixture of both. You know, we want our national companies to be performing all over Scotland. It's fantastic when the National Theatre of Scotland arrives in Shetland or the RSNO arrives in Shetland. Equally, we want Shetland to have its own grassroots activity. So I think it's a balancing act to ensure that both things are happening.
Liz Smith.
Could I just change the theme just a little bit about how easy it is for you to assess the impacts of the sort of cultural exports in terms of, obviously it's a very, just as you mentioned, Mr McKee, about the fact that we're building up to the Commonwealth Games, and it's a very important part of our process in the next 2 years. How do you think that's going? How do you think it's improving our sort of cultural image abroad? And I don't know.
Well, I'll perhaps start and then pass on. I think Scotland's international exports is another untold story. Creative Scotland did an audit with the government and British Council on what was happening in terms of international collaboration. And we're seeing far more of our cultural organisations exporting their work abroad than I think people might realise. I've mentioned before, Visible Fictions Theatre Company does a 150-date tour in the States this year. That's as many performances in the USA as they do in Scotland. Our Made in Scotland programme, supported through the Government's Expo Fund in the Fringe, hugely successful in taking Scottish theatre and dance for export. And even individual artists, some of our best-known artists like Martin Creed, you look at their CVs and it's an international ambassadorial role. We need to do more in coordinating that, and Creative Scotland's board just last week has agreed some geographical priorities that we will work to in trying to develop more in-depth relationships with countries, whilst letting artists work where they want to work. We can also do more on showcasing. So we showcase visual arts in Venice, Scotland in Venice. We showcase film in Cannes. We showcase music at South by Southwest. We need to find other important places to showcase the best of Scottish work. Recently, we worked with other agencies showcasing at Scotland in London during the Olympics. And that enabled us to take Scottish fashion, music, film and festivals and show them to people in London. And I think you'll see more of that sort of activity coming out of our organisation.
Could I just clarify what you meant by greater geographical coordination? What specifically do you mean by that?
Well, working the world is a big place, and the Scottish Government has geographical priorities of countries that it's working with, their economic priorities, and there are natural social partners. With 71 countries in the Commonwealth that we'll be working with during 2014. Okay. During the Edinburgh festivals, we had 150 delegates from 25 countries came through the International Delegate Centre, which was hosted at Creative Scotland. And those delegations inform the way you want to work. So Edinburgh Festivals has been very successful in inviting nations in to showcase within Edinburgh. But equally, we want those nations to take our work out and to have export potential and develop collaborations in India and Brazil and other places. But we can't work everywhere. So what we've been trying to do is to focus and prioritise working with the British Council and the Scottish Government on a number of places where we can make a real difference. Those are likely to include India, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the USA. We're clearly working with on a number of fronts.
And has that meant quite a big shifting of resources into that area, or have you managed to do this? I mean, if you talk about ambassadors, obviously it's not necessarily just money that counts.
We haven't made a huge shift of resources into the international area, but we have uplifted our international budget to try and make a difference. In many cases, we're looking for international partners to buy work and but it's also about building capacity. A lot of cultural organisations have got the potential to work internationally, but they haven't got the expertise or the experience of doing it. So one of the benefits of the FXO review, we actually identified 11 organisations that we think have got greater international potential, and we're going to work with them to build their capacity so that they can start to experience working abroad, either as in an export capacity or collaborating or developing projects with other nations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marco?
Yes, you referred to the promotional trips to Cannes and Venice, and clearly in these financial times eyebrows are raised about any kind of project like that doesn't have very clearly defined outputs. How do you monitor the impact of those sorts of trips, and how can you ensure that we can all have confidence that there's value for money there?
I'll give you two examples, if I may, Marco. The first is Venice, and Phil Miller, I don't know if he's still here. Phil was in Venice. Actually, Phil was also in Cannes. So Phil was in Venice and asked me the question. asked me the question. His other journalist colleagues will be jealous. He asked me the question. It's absolutely the right question. How do you justify spending so much money on one artist in Venice, Carla Black? And I answered and I said, why do people come to the Edinburgh International Festivals? Because it's the best place in the world to showcase theatre, music and dance. Why do people go to Venice? Because it's the best case to showcase the visual arts. Would you want Scotland to be showcasing in Venice? Yes. Would you want to take your best up-and-coming artists? Yes. Would you want to promote the 4 art colleges in Venice, the art colleges in Scotland as places to learn? Yes. Would you want to take students from them to learn and experience curating a major show? Yes. Would you want to sell the work of Scottish artists internationally? Yes. That's why we go to Venice with 1 artist. Next year we're going with 3 artists. And it's not just a showcase for that 1 artist, it's a showcase for a lot of things in Scotland, and we do measure it. And likewise with Cannes, it's no easy trip going to the Cannes Film Festival. We're showcasing film producers to other international buyers. We're showcasing film locations in Scotland to filmmakers. We're showcasing films from Scotland to international festivals. And we're trying to broker deals for Scottish artists and filmmakers. It's a really heavy industry event, and actually our investment in Cannes is relatively small compared to nations like Denmark or Ireland or other places. We have very limited film budgets to make a difference, but I think we punch above our weight. Oh, you have to. If a nation wants to be taken seriously as a film location, as a film producer, you have to be at Cannes, you have to be at Toronto, and you have to be at Berlin. These are 3 really important trade fairs. This is something where you're selling products from Scotland, and just attracting 1 film in, like World War Z or The Railway Man with Nicole Kidman and Colin Firth. The benefits to the Scottish economy far outweigh the relatively modest investment we make in visiting Cannes.
I'll enjoy that answer.
Ian MacArthur.
Thanks very much. Talking there about sort of outputs and measurements, exports and internationalisation, investment and returns. Earlier in proceedings we heard a reference to a criticism of pseudo competition. But I noticed both, I think Gwilym referred to a social entrepreneurial model, and Francis on a couple of occasions I think you've referred to a new economy or a new economic model. Is that language sort of clearly understood? Are there kind of agreed concepts across the stakeholders? Because it does sound like language that is more likely to emit from Scottish enterprise perhaps than Creative Scotland traditionally.
It is incredibly boring language. To be, it really is. There are people like me who have to master it, and there are people like artists who shouldn't have to touch it with a barge pole, because it's incredibly deadening. It's a real passion killer at the best of times. But it is an economy and it is an industry. We run a business as well as an art centre. 2 things go hand in hand. So for someone like me, I'm in the middle, and that's my role. But my role is also to keep artists away from that, so they can get on with creating. They know obviously how to do business themselves, and much better than us sometimes. But it's you have to put that language to one side and actually think about getting down to creating and doing daft things and staring at the wall for 3 hours. It has its place, and it has its place certainly within a lesser funded country now where there's a recession. You have to acknowledge that. You have to try and get value for money. You have to try and make sure that you're getting the most out of your centre, your organisation, whatever. But you then also have to sort of draw a line and let people be creative and just stop at a certain point and take that away. So there's a place for bureaucrats, I think, within this which deal with that and deal with that very well. And there's a place for tourism and the arts, that's undeniable. But for artists, that's not how anyone sits down to write a poem or form a band. And they really aren't necessarily interested in that. There's no good reason they should be, and if they are, they're probably not very good. So you've got to keep a distance from them, and you've got to protect them. You create a creative space, and you have an infrastructure that makes that space work and is protected. So there's a schizophrenic attitude.
And is that done through intermediaries, or is that a role where Creative Scotland are providing support to artists or artist-led bodies?
Both.
Well, I was going to take my turn to disagree with you, Francis, because I think That's actually part. I think that's part of the problem when we're talking about transparency. If there's this culture that says you've got to protect artists from understanding what these things are and from this kind of language, then you end up with the situation of artists then saying, we don't get what's going on and we think there's something being hidden behind this language. So I agree that, you know, like, you don't want to get hung up on having to write in that way, but it's also important that it's not a mystification process. It's not. Yeah. We don't want to be wrapped in cotton wool.
No, and I don't think anyone wants. But you just don't want to spend the whole day talking to an artist about VAT either. It's a balance. Fair point. And I say they have their dealers and organisations, and they know business too.
It should be said the Scottish Enterprise rejoices in the name of Passion Colour. I think it's a badge of honour.
Very briefly, and I think this is one of the things that hasn't been fully understood about the model that the government's created with Creative Scotland. We invest in individual artists on their own terms, we invest in social enterprises, we invest in charities, we also invest in businesses, and actually sometimes in commercial businesses, because we have this role working in partnership with Scottish Enterprise, HIE, around the creative industries. So, you know, we are investing in innovation, technology, apps, TV production. This is essentially kind of commercial activity, but it's about the economic value. So some of our decisions are made on economic grounds, some are made on artistic grounds, and some are made on social grounds, and we have to create the balance across all of those.
Isn't that part of the problem? I mean, it's not a criticism, but isn't it part of the problem that your responsibility is so broad that effectively it's quite difficult to understand?
I think Creative Scotland, on the face of it, might seem a relatively simple organisation. It's a very complex organisation. You know, we're an £80 million budget. We're dealing across a very wide range of portfolios, wider than any other cultural agency of its type, I think, in Europe. It is a model that other countries are watching. We've had a number of countries coming to talk to Creative Scotland about the model of putting film, creative industries and culture together. And then you add, you know, our promotional role and advocacy role, and it is a powerful and interesting model. But it's complex, and it's complex to get those messages across about why you invest in a TV production, or why you invest in the intellectual property around a new technology for promoting piping educationally, internationally. These are things which Old Arts Council might not have been involved in, but we are.
Well, is that very complexity that you've just described part of the reason why there's been such vehement criticism of the organisation?
I think the criticism is about change. It's about the pace of change. It's about us needing to communicate a little bit better how we're doing that beyond just the organisations that are changing. I think we've got to hold our hands up and say there's areas we could have done this better. We shouldn't have done this as quickly as we have. But we feel very confident in where we're heading, and in dealing with that complexity, and in trying to deliver something that is very special, because culture is an enormous strength of Scotland. Gino heard me speaking at an event on Friday evening in Inverness, and when you start to describe the cultural strengths of Scotland, you just can't stop. One of our difficulties is getting that message across. And I always say, you know, we'll succeed by celebrating success.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that we are? I don't know, but it's over the worst. But are we over the hump? Are we? Can you see progress now being made? And more importantly, can those out in the artistic community see the progress being made? And can they see through the difficulties and challenges that are being faced at the moment to the other side of that?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it serves nobody's interests, Creative Scotland, artists, the government, for there to be public rows going on. We want to listen more. We want to engage people through our sector reviews. I think the proof is in the pudding. And when we finish the flexible funding review and we start to invest using lottery in those organisations, I think people will understand the strategy of where we were heading. And we've already got 15 of those organisations have bid in. We're currently assessing them, and we'll be taking decisions within the next month.
Okay, thank you. So, Mark, you had a final question?
Yes. It follows on quite nicely from the point you were making about the breadth of your work. I've submitted a couple of parliamentary questions recently asking the government for their opinion on a report that was, I believe, co-authored for yourselves and Scottish Enterprise, dealing with the size of various sectors in Scotland, because it had raised eyebrows from the computer games industry in particular, which was found to have 0 employees and less than £10 million in gross value added. This was generally in the methodology down to conflating games developers with software development in general. I asked the government, and I'm awaiting for the written PQ response, to restate their support for the computer games industry, largely because it's a major employer in my own constituency, in particular Rockstar North, which is based in Edinburgh Central, having won it from Dundee some years ago. Could you take this opportunity just to state how you see computer games within the artistic life of Scotland and their importance economically, so that there is no doubt whatsoever that they are taken to be an important part of the cultural economy?
Yes. Can I first explain, it's an economic impact or economic contribution study that Creative Scotland worked on with the government, with Scottish Enterprise and HIE as partners. And we did use consultants, and this is a very specialist area. But what it was about doing was trying to get the first overall picture of the economic contribution of the cultural sector for Scotland. We'd got a very good economic impact study of Edinburgh festivals worth 271 million, more than golf. We've got a very good economic impact study of Glasgow as a city, but we hadn't got it for the whole of Scotland. So it was a geographical benchmarking, and it was a trying to understand the sectors. We did it based on primary data, and the data's as good as the data you've got. And it threw up some anomalies, particularly around gaming in the computer industry. I do have a briefing note. Rather than going into the technicals of it, I'll happily share that with you, and I'm sure it's wending its way into your parliamentary question-answer. Creative Scotland isn't primarily responsible for investing in the gaming industry. That's Scottish Enterprise. It's one of their priorities, the digital side. But we are responsible for helping promote the creative industries, and we do take that side of things very seriously. And I think the interface between the gaming industry and our ambitions to have creativity reach into every home and to have digital activity engaging young people is really important. As we consulted on our National Youth Arts strategy, people are interested in things that aren't the core art forms. They're interested in new technology and gaming and the interface of digital activity and new media. So we need to embrace some of the creativity that's in there and apply it in some of our other areas of our work.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of our witnesses for coming in this morning? It's been very useful. And I thank you very much for the evidence that you've given this morning. Before I close the meeting, though, members may have noticed that there's a motion laid before Parliament today, which will, in fact, make a slight change to the committee. So, assuming that motion passes at decision time this evening, can I thank very much Jean Urquhart and Marco Biaggi for their contribution to the committee since May 2011, and wish them well on the new committees that they perhaps will be moving to after decision time this evening. Thank you very much. And I close the meeting.